I want you to use your imagination with me for a little bit. I'm sure you're wondering why there's pretzels on the screen, and we'll get to that. But first, I want you to imagine you have worked and worked. You've invited your neighbors. You've invited some friends. You've got a barbecue planned. You're going to cook some steaks. You got some corn on the cob, some baked potatoes. And in fact, people are starting to show up. You've got the steaks on the grill. It's getting dark. And so you turn on the lights there on the back porch where everybody's going to gather. And as they begin to sit down and the food begins to be served, somebody asks, "Would you pass the salt?" But you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you. This is a salt-free meal. I've not seasoned the meat when I cooked it with salt. I've not seasoned the corn or the potatoes with salt, and I have no salt to share with you. So this will be salt-free." Okay. People grumble, but what are you going to do, right? They began to cut into their steak and taste it and think it just doesn't have a lot of taste to it. Somebody bites into their corn, and what's corn on the cob without at least a little bit of salt sprinkled on there? Nobody's even interested at all in those potatoes because, well, nothing else tastes any good either, so why go there? But then to top it off, electricity goes out and it goes dark. There's no light to be seen. What's there to enjoy anyways, right? The food doesn't taste good, much less look good. So the party, well, it pretty much ends. But what does that have to do with pretzels? Well, I was afraid if I put a picture of steak dinner, you probably wouldn't pay attention to what I was saying. But the idea of pretzels brings this idea of salty. Right? You think of pretzels and you think of that flavor. You think of the salt that comes with a pretzel. A pretzel without salt just, well, isn't any good. And when we think about salt and pretzels, I want that to remind you of Matthew chapter 5. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, Jesus tells the people there as he's preaching the Sermon on the Mount, "You are the salt of the earth." Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth." He goes on to say, "But if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You're the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden." But he goes on then also, not only are you the salt of the earth, but you are the light of the world. A city on a hill, he says, cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a blanket or a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Now, if you look up things that salt does, one of the lists that I found, things that salt does, there is at least 85 different things that salt does. And I'm sure we could talk about at least 85 things that light does. But I want us to focus in on 3 things this morning that salt and light have in common. Just 3 things. The first thing is that salt and light, they're important for survival. We know light is essential. Without light, things don't grow. If we were to suddenly lose the sunlight, if it went out, the earth would die. Salt also is a necessity of life, but we tend often to take it for granted. We can pick up salt at the grocery store for real cheap, right? Just a few cents for a pound of salt. It doesn't cost hardly anything. But go back to the days before refrigeration when you had to use salt to preserve your meats. And salt is a lot less easy to come by. Go back then even into Jesus' day and time. Salt was often used as a form of currency. The word where we get salary from is salarium, which refers back to when Roman soldiers were often paid in salt. We also often use the phrase about a hard worker, they're worth their salt. So when Jesus, talking about his followers here, talking about his followers for all time to come, to say that you are salt and you are light, Jesus says you as a Christian, you are essential for the survival of the world. You know, it's no wonder Jesus would say to the people here that no one would ever light a lamp and place it under a bowl. There's good reason no one would do that. For these people, their lights were oil lamps. And if you put a lighted lamp, put a candle under a bowl, it burns out. Take your light out in the open, though, and it burns bright. As a Christian, when we hide our faith, when we hide our light, it burns out. It's extinguished. To let our light out, to use our life as salt, to season the world around us, we have to take risks. There'll be times when we have to get out of our comfort zones. There'll be times when we may be inconvenienced. There'll be times when we have to put forth a little bit extra effort. We may have to get our hands dirty. We may have to be more bold than we're accustomed to being. But all those things, if we are going to be salt and light for those who need it. The second thing salt and light have in common is that they produce purity. You ever taken some clothes off a line outside that have dried in the sunlight and smelled how wonderful the smell is? They try to produce it, right, in our laundry to have sun-dried linen scented things. Salt also is purifying. Think about wounds when you're cut. We talk about rubbing salt in a wound and how it hurts, but it also has healing properties as well to help those wounds to heal better. In the Old Testament, salt was often used to make the sacrifices more acceptable, more pleasing to God. Jesus, here in this passage in Matthew 5, though, makes this statement, if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. Now, in a technical sense, salt doesn't lose its saltiness. Sodium chloride is a stable compound. But for the people that Jesus is talking to, their salt comes from the area around the Dead Sea. And that salt is mixed with a whole lot of other minerals and impurities. And in those mixtures, in those combinations, salt is a lot more soluble. And so if it got wet, if it got rained on, these salt crystals, they've lost their saltiness. And Jesus here says they're no good. They're worthless. And most likely what you would do with those, throw them out on the road. They're no better than gravel to be trampled under feet by men. See, when we talk about the salt that's lost its taste, the salt that's no longer salty, to look back at what Jesus originally said or what the author originally was writing here, the word moreno is a word we use still in our language today. But when we say it, it's moron. The concept of salt that's lost its saltiness. The word of moreno, moron, to be made a fool, to be foolish. Christians who are contaminated by the sin lose their effectiveness. A Christian who lives like the rest of the world and then tries to tell others about Christ, they just look like a fool to the people around them. That's why it matters where you go. That's why it matters who you spend time with. That's why it matters the websites you go to on the internet, the movies you watch, the books and the magazines you read, the TV shows that you watch. How can we as Christians have a purifying effect on the world around us when we ourselves are contaminated and have lost that saltiness? Now, I'm not saying it's an easy thing to do. And in fact, there's two extremes we have to avoid when doing this. See, oftentimes today, Christians get too involved in the world around us. We get too involved in our culture, we become contaminated, but the other extreme is just as bad as well. Think back in history to the time of the Middle Ages and the monastic culture, the time of monasteries, when the monks and certain priests would shut themselves away from the world to keep themselves pure. But they're shut away from the world and they no longer have any influence on the world around them. You see, churches sometimes can fall into that same trap as well. We want to protect ourselves. We want to protect our families from the world. But if we get too far into separating ourselves from the culture and from the world, what influence can we have? I read a quote that said, when the church retreats into the monastery of their four-walled church building, they cease to be of any use. Their light is extinguished under a bowl, and their salt loses its flavor. So how do we stay pure while still staying in the world? Jesus answered that question in that same passage. After he tells the people, you are the light of the world, he goes on to tell them, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. See, we as individuals are lights. We're small. But a city, a combination of lights, well, you can't hide that. The more lights that gather, the brighter it shines. We were never meant to shine alone. When we gather together, we help one another to stay pure. We encourage one another. We hold each other accountable so that we're ready to go back into the world. That's why it's so important to be here when we worship, when we have Bible class, when we gather together. It's important to be together, to encourage one another, to hold one another accountable, to lift one another up. And I understand that that's different right now. It's difficult sometimes to gather together. There are a great number of people who are still worried about being in groups, and that's understandable. And so we have the technology, when it works, to live stream so that people can join us in their homes and in the places of refuge. And I'm sure that one day we will all be back together. We're designed to be in a community with other believers. God's plan is that we be a city on a hill. You can't put a city under a bowl. When we shine together, our light reaches far out into the darkness. Both salt and light also reveal truth. When you sprinkle salt on that piece of steak, you don't say, boy, how good that salt tastes. No, you talk about how much better the steak tastes, how much better the food that you've added it to tastes, because salt enhances, it brings out that flavor. It's the effect that we as Christians can have in our homes, at our jobs, in school, in our neighborhood, and yes, even in our church. If we are a follower of Jesus, we don't hurt the church. We naturally enhance the environment. We naturally enhance the church and the homes if we are truly following Christ everywhere we go. In the letter to the Colossians in chapter 4, he says, let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should answer each person. Seasoned with salt. This is not necessary to always be preaching to others or to be debating people. You see, the way that we talk, the way that we act, the way that we react to stress at work, at home, at school, all these places, it makes a difference. If our conversations are full of grace, seasoned with salt, we make an impact. And we draw attention not to ourselves, but to the one we follow. That's how we can be the salt of the earth in our lives. Salt enhances flavor. Light reveals the truth around it. When you walk in a room, into a dark room, and turn on the light, you don't pay attention to the light that's now shining, but you see what's in the room. You see the furniture. You see whether it's clean or it's messy. You see the dust. You see the things around. And when light comes in, it reveals the truth of what's there. As a follower of Jesus, wherever you go, you shine a light just by being who you are, by helping people to see the truth about God and about their own lives. It's amazing the effect that just one Christian can have when they love others the way that Christ loves us. You see, maybe you feel like your light isn't that bright. I carry this little flashlight with me all the time. And it's small, and in a room like this, it wouldn't do a whole lot. But when it's in a dark room and I need to see something, this little light does a whole lot to help to see, to notice the things, to find what it is I'm looking for. And when we all put our lights together, it overcomes the darkness. It overcomes the evil in the world. See, as Christians, we should never be afraid to come into contact with darkness. Darkness is passive. Darkness is nothing except the absence of light. And when the light of Christ enters, darkness gives way. But I want in this passage I want you to notice what Jesus doesn't say here in Matthew 5. He doesn't say you need to become salt and light. See, as Christians, as followers of Christ, he makes us salt and he makes us light. You don't have to figure out how to season the world around you. You don't have to figure out how to shine. You just have to figure out how to follow Christ. And he tells us what he needs from us, what he wants from us. I would say this room right now is full of salt and light. But the purpose of our shining together is not to draw attention to ourselves so that people say, wow, the church that meets there at Hampton is a great group of people. It's wonderful for them to say that. But our ultimate goal is to point people to the truth, that they might see the God that we serve, to say, I want to be a part of a group of people that serve that God, that lift him up, that season the world around them, that shine their light in the darkness. But how do we do that? How do we influence the world around us? And so today, as we apply this, there's many ways that we could. But I want to share with you something that our elders have recently gotten for us to make the job of sharing our faith with people around us a little bit easier. It started with a few months ago when I had a conversation with a young girl at Walmart who had brought the groceries out, talking about my job. It's easy to start a job about faith when I tell them I'm a minister. But she wanted to know where the church was located that I attended. And her family had just moved here and they were wanting to find a place. And I told her about this, but she had a whole other rest of her shift. And I'm sure it was difficult for her to remember that. And I thought, I wish there was a way to give her something to remind her about that church, about that person who told her about a church. And so the idea that we came with was to have just a small little card. And these cards you may have seen as you came in by the bulletins. There's a display rack, 2 of them. They both have the same cards. But it's a card that has just our Hampton Church of Christ name. It has our address, our phone number. It has our website. It has our Facebook. Has ways for people to get into contact with us, to find us, that when we tell them about the church and where we're located, a way to remind them, this is where I can find that. One of the things that's on these cards is a QR code. And you may ask, well, what's a QR code, Daniel? Well, it's a little square box with a bunch of black and white dots in it. If you have a cell phone, you use your camera, you put that little box in the window of the camera. You don't have to do anything. It recognizes it, and it says, do you want to open this? And it loads the website. The 2 on the church card load our Facebook and our website so that people can contact us, so that people can find us. But that's something to get them here. But say you want to tell somebody, you're having a conversation, they've asked about, I'm just not sure about what truth is. I'm not sure about how do I know what's true. Well, we got a card. Just a little card, and this is small, you can't see it. Let me put on, we have 5 different cards that have these topics, that have these things, whether they're searching for the truth, that maybe they ask why there's so many churches, what do I need to do to be saved? Where do you go when you die? Or just a small, kind of a beginner's Bible study. These cards are a way you can use them yourself to grow in your knowledge, your understanding of Scripture, but also to share those with people. Maybe to go through the study with them. Maybe to share it with them so they can go through whenever it's convenient for them to help them. A way for us to share our faith. When conversations happen, and they will happen, we have this tool to take 1 or 2 of these, to share these, to show people our light, to point them to Jesus, to enhance the world around us. Our Hampton cards, something like that. I encourage you, though, this week, if you haven't already, when you're leaving, to grab a couple of those cards. We have more that we'll put out when those are gone. Give those out. Give those away. Invite people to the loving congregation that meets here. And let's point people to God. Today, we offer an invitation, the opportunity, if you haven't given your life to Christ, and if you are ready and desire to become salt in the world, to become a light, to shine to those around, or maybe you've lost those things and you desire to regain the ability to share those with the world around you. If you're ready to be baptized, to become a follower of Christ, the water is ready. If you need the prayers or the opportunity to study with someone, we want to offer that to you as well. If you would respond now and come while we stand and while we sing.